Hey, folks, welcome to Uncommon Sense in Current Times. I'm here with Dr. Michael Schwartz, who is an amazing career. It does all different things he's an entrepreneur, owns two medical clinics in Jersey and in Florida. He used to be a former police officer who now teaches people about body language and different forms of communication to both private and government entities. Recently, he's written a book called Fauci's Fiction, and he's talking about what the government did not want to tell you about COVID. And then, most importantly, we just discovered with him that we're both New York Yankee fans, and especially the way the Yankees are starting this year. As long as we can keep it up, there's not going to be anything better than that. So, but we'll have the interview anyway, just so that we can talk about the other things. So. Dr. Schwartz, thanks for coming on. Oh, one other thing too, as you see in his background, he's also a host of the Two Mics Live show as well on Rumble. And so sorry about that, but
I appreciate
welcome
it.
to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So you wrote the book Fauci's Fiction. I just kind of want to go into this, and I'm going to just start out because I know why I care about it. But I mean, COVID was 4 years ago. So a lot of people could sit there and say, okay, so what? We're past it. We now get COVID. Matter of fact, I had COVID 2 weeks ago. I took some vitamins, some ivermectin, and I'm fine. The CDC is now redacting everything. So who cares? Like, why does it matter? So why does it matter to you?
Well, if you read the book, if you knew what I knew, you would have the same opinion you do now 4 years prior. And that's kind of the point. We knew all this stuff like a month into testing. And it wasn't, we were the first company to do testing in the state of New Jersey. And that kind of happened by happenstance. We've done something called a respiratory pathogen panel for a very long time. So if you had come to me sick years ago, I like to say my patients knew what COVID swabs were long before the world did. Because if you come to me 10 years ago and you were sick, we were swabbing you. It was going off to the lab to find out what it was. And I had said at that time, I said, look, COVID's just going to be another thing that's on our respiratory pathogen panel. There's 31 things on it. COVID's the 31st thing. There used to be 30. And now that's exactly where we are. But a month into testing, we kind of saw the trend lines going, and we're going, this doesn't match what we're seeing on the news. And the news would take about 6, 12, sometimes 18 months to catch up to what we were telling our patients and trying to tell the world, but no one wanted to listen. And of course, that evolved over time when you get into the vaccines, but there's so much data. And I think we're the only company in the country that has as much horizontal data. That's where you test a lot of times the same exact patient every single week for 3 years. We have that on thousands of patients, and you get a very different opinion of COVID, a very different picture from the 30,000-foot view when you do that.
So I'm curious. So my memory of how the media reported it was, it was in the East, like China, et cetera, kind of in the fall of 19. Then it was a hit Italy pretty hard. It kind of ransacked Italy. Then it came over to the West Coast right at the beginning of 20, and then by March of 2020, it was, that's when they shut down everything. Like it was that's when March Madness got shut down. That's when all that stuff happened. Was COVID around, like from your experience and what you were seeing on it? Were you even aware that there was this issue that was coming here or that was here before it became such a big news and part of the media scare?
Yeah, it's kind of a complicated question to answer, but you can bifurcate it. So yes, it was around long before we started locking people down. As a matter of fact, I caught it in Yankee camp when I was down in January of 2020. I got super sick. I mean, it was like, 4 weeks of a cough that just wouldn't go away, fever, all this nonsense. And of course, once we started testing for it in March, I knew I had it at that point. I couldn't test for it. But in March, when we started testing for it, and you start to see the symptomology and everything that went along with it, loss of taste and smell and everything, I realized I had COVID. And so were a lot of other people who left camp at that time. Everybody likes to blame Shane Spencer because he was coming over from Korea. And I've talked to Shane. It's kind of a joke now. He negates that. But he was coming over from Korea and everybody got sick at camp. But it wasn't Shane's fault, to be on the record here. But a lot of folks.
So he's not real patient zero.
He wasn't. No, Shane's a great guy. We just like to pick on him because he had come over at that point. But yeah, folks were getting sick long before they locked the world down. Once we synthesized it and started testing, the first actual day we could start testing was on March 16th of 2020. I had my first 4 patients that day, my first couple positives, and you're kind of like the rest of the world. You don't know if this is the big one that you've been watching all these documentaries for years on the History Channel and Armageddon. Is this really it? So we're outside testing people with PPE on their front porches, being very careful. And you start to see trends very, very quickly. Your first couple patients, to put it in perspective, just give you a little background. I called every single positive patient personally myself for the first 2 years. So I was recording data, I was recording symptomology. So those first couple patients you're calling, and they're 75 years old and they got a little fever, they're sick, they got a cough. You're wondering, are they going to make it? Are they going to be okay? Do they need to go to the hospital? A couple days later, you're following up with them and they're fine. They're getting over it in a couple days. As soon as that fever broke, they seem to be fine. So the next week's patients, and by the way, I was the only guy in New Jersey doing this. Those tests that we had were like gold. I mean, you couldn't get them. There was a worldwide shortage. Every single week, I might get 10, 20, 30, until a couple weeks in when the lab started doing something genius, and then I got thousands. That we were doing school districts, police departments, and then those people on the street. And you start to see these trends. The first week's patients told you what to tell the next week's patients because they want to know, like, what's going to happen to me. And you're telling them, in my experience, everybody seems to be fine. Now you get a couple weeks into that, and you're not losing one patient. And by the way, I had 19,000 patients. We did 44,000 tests. I only had 4 patients go to the hospital, and that's out of the entire grouping. And they were a little elderly, comorbidities, co-infections. That's another thing we should get into. The sickest of the sick had co-infections. And you would never know that by going to Walgreens and getting a rapid test. You have to do what's called a PCR, a respiratory pathogen panel, and look for, you're looking for pretty much everything. If somebody's sick, I want to identify, is it the flu? Is it a bacterial infection? Is it COVID? A lot of the folks that were coming back sick with classic symptomology, and that's important, had a co-infection. Usually it was Staph aureus. I had a guy about 3.5 years ago who had COVID, Staph, H flu time. You can imagine if that guy went to a Walgreens, got home test, and thought COVID was the worst thing in the world. He was sick from the RSV and the H flu. So you have to put COVID in perspective. It's not just negative or positive. It's negative or positive with caveats, and you have to know the caveats to understand COVID in its totality.
Two things that kind of you saying that kind of reminds me, because my daughter in 19, I mean, she couldn't get rid of a cough at all, and like even to the point where the school center said, look, she can't come back, we don't know what's going on with her. And we took her to a walk-in clinic, and the doctor looked at us and said, well, do you think it's that COVID? And we're like, I don't, that's why we paying you. Like, actually, technically, that's why our insurance company is paying you, but still, but why? And it was this awkward kind of exchange of, do you think it's this? Is it not this? And in talking with doctors, particularly early on, they had a level of fear on this that I've never seen with anything else, never seen like with, H1N1 or anything else that happened in the past. And I guess, do you think that's where part of the failure of doctors during this point in time? Do you think that was they were more afraid of it than what was necessary?
It was a total mess. And I know it's a short interview. When you put it in totality, we could literally talk about this for 4 hours. The doctors originally, when they shut their doors when we needed them the most, I mean, that was probably one of the most damaging things. But the fact that they didn't have the data on this thing themselves, they were never answering questions. Even out throughout COVID, they never answered questions from a perspective of based on what. Do you have data? Do you understand it in totality? Do you test for it? A lot of these people, you're going to the doctor looking for answers, they don't even know what to do. They're getting their directives from the CDC, and of course the media is blowing this up so much that a lot of these doctors, as I mentioned, shut their doors. So I had folks coming to me asking for a COVID test in order to go see their doctor. I mean, how bizarre is that? And these patients would rightfully so get mad and say, well, can't I just come to you? And I'd say, sure. I mean, look, I'm a research doctor, but I employ medical doctors in my practices. So we do primary care. They're welcome to come to us. We didn't have any stupid rules. We never required masks in our office because we know masks don't work for viruses. So we wanted to educate our patients on this. So every time a patient would come in with COVID, a lot of times, and you got to remember what's in this book everybody wanted to know this in the first couple of weeks of COVID. I mean, the
Right.
first 2 years, I would give dissertation after dissertation to each patient, sometimes an hour long, to calm them down, get them to go out and live their lives, take the mask off, realize that this is not the end of the world. And it took that long for people to stop asking those questions until the media kind of caught up. So I'm not really thrilled with the doctors during this thing. There are some really good ones out there, but the majority of the folks that tried to handle COVID just didn't. They just laid down their swords and said, "Let's go home," because we didn't want to give it to folks in their family. But that's really the wrong approach. We could have all been talking about this from the start, asking guys like me, what are you seeing on the ground? To get a perspective on this thing, so we could have avoided that exercise of lockdowns and suicide rates going up. I mean, that was just, I mean, it's a mess.
Yeah, I was so shocked at the way I'm in the restaurant business as well, and we were getting hit from all different kinds. And our governor said, "I'm going to leave it up to each county to make their own decisions." So every county we had a restaurant in had different rules. And then of course you had some people that were big Fox News watchers, and they were like, "You can't do this," and other people were CNN watchers, and they're like, "You're not wearing a mask and a shield and wearing gloves as you come and talk." I mean, it was amazing, and you just had to try to be reasonable to the customers. I even had a person, and I'm not kidding. I shook his hand. He went and filed a police report for assault against me. And the funny thing was this guy held his hand out to me and I shook it. We had the camera footage to show it, so it never went anywhere from there. But I'm like, it was just shocking that volume that was occurring. And then again, yeah, I would talk to doctors, and then I was realizing they don't know. So I started trying to do research, like from the CDC website, and what the media was reporting and what the headline was, the CDC, didn't match the studies that were being reported within the CDC. So you had to dig deep to find it. So if I can't trust the people that the government is saying, like Fauci, like the NIH guy, I can't remember his name now. If I can't trust what they're saying, and I can't really trust my doctors to do the research on it, what do I do as an individual that doesn't have the amount of curiosity that I have?
Scary, right? It exposed a lot of weaknesses in our system. And, people always ask me, if this happened again, would we do anything different? And the answer is probably not, because we haven't learned anything. We have so
Right.
much data. We went through so much. And this was the frustrating thing for me. I mean, every single day you would hear a story on the news. My staff and I would look at each other like, how are they not reporting? Like, we would try to tell people. I would go on the radio a couple times a week down in my Key West office. And even the radio folks, the folks I was doing interviews with, would kind of, you could see them almost rolling their eyes when they would ask me a question, because it wasn't matching what they were hearing on TV. And I'm trying to tell them, like, look, I'm telling you from a perspective, I've got thousands and thousands of patients. So whatever you want to talk about, whether it was antibodies or the vaccines, we can get into that, because that just, I mean, it was a timeline that evolved. But we were always at least 12 months ahead of the media, always. And it was so frustrating for me, because we just wanted to go on national TV one time, but I don't have a direct line to Sean Hannity or, somebody like that to say, "Hey, this is what the practitioners are seeing." And it was really frustrating. But you try to put your finger on, like, where does this go in the future? And it's unfortunate, because no one wants to learn the lessons. We went through 4 years of literal hell for a lot of people. And
Yeah.
nobody wants to dissect that. So I applaud you for talking about it still, because when are we going to have this national conversation? It's not happening, but it needs to happen. Otherwise, we're going to go through this again at some point.
So going to, oh boy, there's two directions I want to take this. The Demas's family has been in the restaurant business for many generations. We have been serving people in the Middle Tennessee market for 34 years. Try our spaghetti kits, our pot roast, which we slow cook for 4 hours, or our world famous baked chicken and rice soup, which many locals have dubbed Greek penicillin for when you feel under the weather. We make our food fresh, and upon placing our order with us, we freeze the order and send it to your house. Demas's is more than a business. 5 generations of restaurant operators have taught us many things about food, but more importantly, we have recognized that we don't sell food. We sell the experience of bringing people and families together, which our country desperately needs. So go to demasfamilykitchen.com and share in this journey today. And for right now, use the code UNCOMMON to get 10% off of your order. That's demasfamilykitchen.com. let's, you say go into it at some point. I have to go this way before I talk about Fauci, because we're looking at this mysterious disease X that's coming down, and I'm sure you've heard of that. And I mean, and the idea that we might have to have, the digital IDs in order to, in order to get treated for disease X, everything like. It seems like that we're not learning the lessons from COVID, but it seems like the people in power and control, and I may be oversimplifying it. I may be too conspiracy theorist when it comes to this, but it seems like the people who have power and control did learn from COVID. They learned how to suppress people. They learned how to do that, and they're using it for the next stage up. What's your thoughts on disease X, and then how that really kind of applies to what you saw, what Fauci did during that period of time, or are
Well,
they completely separate?
I mean, disease X is theoretically, it's put out. It's a theoretical disease that may happen, and it's something that is going to happen at some point, whether it's in our lifetime or it's years after we're all gone. My personal issue is what I just mentioned, is that we're not prepared because we haven't learned lessons from COVID. What are we prepared for when the next thing happens? I mean, we're going to lock down things again. We're going to wear surgical masks for, and what are we going to put on bandanas for a virus that it's just stupidity. So I don't really concern myself with disease X. And by the way, the book itself is not about Fauci. I know it's called Fauci's Fiction.
Yeah.
He's mentioned 3 times in the book. A lot of people are
Oh,
very surprised, especially the folks on the left, when they actually get past the cover and actually read it. They'll say, I was really surprised that this book wasn't bashing. It's not a political hit piece. It's just not a political narrative in the book. Fauci gets the cover because he was the guy at the podium, but he's the cover for Birx, Walensky, everybody that was CNN, everybody who was spouting this message of doom and gloom. And don't get me wrong, in the first couple weeks, we had no idea. As I said, we're on people's porches with PPE. I had folks at the hospital telling me stories of doom and gloom and people in body bags. Meanwhile, I'm telling them, look, I'm out on the street going to folks' homes and testing them and then following up with them, and they're fine. They're all recovering. They're not going to the hospital. They're not on a ventilator. That's another topic. We can get into the treatment and how that affected COVID. But these folks were recovering quite nicely. You realize when you test everybody at one time. Everybody has this. The majority of the population is not sick from it. Although if you were watching TV, every time I would go to someone's home, they thought if they came back positive, they were going to die. So the dichotomy was very real, and that lasted for a very long time.
yeah.
My issue with disease X is if something major was to happen, we've got 2 separate entities, right? You got the people who are so desensitized because they want everything's fake. This is wrong. This didn't work, blah, blah, blah. You got people who are, it's like the boy who cried wolf. You got people who could be very, very seriously injured by something that's real versus a bunch of other folks that don't know how to mitigate this properly at all. So I think we've made ourselves worse if something comes along.
Well, as long as we maintain the arrows at the Walmarts and grocery stores where you can only go.
I think
I never understood how COVID traveled north-south but didn't travel east-west. I didn't understand how that worked, but I'm not a researcher like you. It just kind of.
Peter, when you and I look back at footage of like the Hindenburg and you hear the folks, and you watch back at some of the things that folks have done 100 years ago, and you go, wow, that was kind of dumb how they handled that, or it sounded weird. They did some stupid. People 100 years from now are going to look back at us wearing masks and going in these directions in grocery stores, and what were they doing? I know the average IQ in this country is 100, but it's funny when you can actually see someone's IQ. Now I can go to the airport and see folks with masks on and a face shield and realize, they've probably got some issues that need some help. So it's funny and scary at the same time.
Like what George Carlin says. He says you got to think about how stupid the average person is and realize half the people are dumber than that. So,
Right. Right.
all right. So let's move to treatment then. So because again, that was just something else that doctors traditionally treat diseases. I mean, that's kind of, and I say that I think that's still a relatively new phenomenon when you look at the history of the medical field. I mean, I know like my grandfather never wanted to go to the hospital because that's where you went to die. But at some point in recent medical history, it was treatment was the big piece. But again, it seemed like doctors didn't even want to attempt treatment. And there were some great exceptions out there. Dr. Peter McCullough was one. Dr. Hotze, who in Houston's another one. I mean, there were people out there that were really looking at it and trying to treat it. But overall, it seemed like everyone just kind of wanted, again, just hope that it just wouldn't hit them and disappear. Was it a laziness or was it fear that you think created that for that lack of treatment options?
Both. I see. Well, I like to use the term cognitive distortion all the time. I read a story about a cardiologist who I was having dinner with one night in front of a group of people, and this is later on when the vaccines came out. And he said, I used to recommend these vaccines all the time, and now I don't anymore. Now that I see the issues with them, and I kind of stopped and looked at him and called him a couple words, and he said to me, "Where are you going with this? Questioning, Mike?" And I said, "You're a cardiologist. Why would you recommend a COVID vaccine with having no data? No, you've never treated a COVID patient. You never tested anyone for COVID. But here you are as a cardiologist recommending it to your patients when they ask you a question." I said, "You should have never recommended it in the first place. You had no data on it whatsoever." And he kind of looked at me, he goes, "You're right." And I said, "You're the issue. You're part of the problem, because a lot of these folks want to give an answer. It's cognitive distortion." So you had a lot of folks in the beginning with these, as we mentioned, they're getting it from the CDC narrative. The CDC recommends, anybody over 65 with comorbidity. That's the last person I would give a vaccine to. They cause inflammation in areas that it's not supposed to be in. It could cause a worse problem for that person. So there's so many levels to that question. It just depends on where you want to start. I don't know. Let's break it down to something specific, because we can get into treatment. Treatment, we use very simple things. We use vitamin C, vitamin D, zinc, and electrolytes. That's it. That's all we use the entire time. Then we started proning patients when they were having breathing problems, but we never put them on ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine. We never Paxlovid. I had one practitioner down in Florida who used it for about a month, and we saw so many COVID rebounds on it. We said, that's it. We're not using this thing ever again. Meanwhile, I sit at home and I see all these commercials for, got COVID, Paxlovid, and I'm rolling my eyes again, going, we used it in practice. It doesn't work. I remember when Dr. Fauci took it when he had COVID, and I said to my whole staff, wait for the COVID rebound. And all of a sudden, like a week later, he got real sick again. COVID rebound from the Paxlovid. You learn things when you treat that many patients. And it baffles my mind that the media, like I said, 12 months behind. That's unacceptable for something that's locking folks down, where we have suicide rates going through the roof, where kids' learning is curbed. That is unacceptable, to not talk to folks who are doing this every single day, to say, hey, guys, what are you seeing? Can you give us some trends? Can you tell us what's working, what's not? The stuff that was working was really, really simple. And we use the exact same treatment regimen today, unless, of course, the patient has a co-infection. And again, as I mentioned, the sickest of the sick out of those 4,000 positives had co-infections. Classic symptomology is what people expected. So if you think about this from like the lay perspective, when someone gets sick, or at least when they get an illness like COVID or a flu, they expect to have what's called classic symptomology: cough, fever, shortness of breath, something like that. The majority of folks who were coming back positive from COVID, it was about 85% of them, did not have classic symptomology. Okay. Right. Now that's confusing to someone, because if you're calling a cop to tell them, yeah, you tested positive at yesterday's testing, they're pissed off. They think it's a false positive. I could test that same cop over and over and over again against 99 negatives and repeat the data every single day to show them he is 100% positive. You have to understand what's called CT value. That's called cycle threshold on a PCR test. Sensitivity is logarithmic. It's not linear. So it doesn't go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It goes 1, 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, so on, all the way to level 36. And that's the cutoff level for reputable labs, level 36. At that level, I only need 9 copies of a virus to tell me it's in your system and bound. So at that level, you're not going to have a symptom, because you don't have this abundance of virus going on in your system, where it's breaking down the mitochondria of your cells and taking away that energy where you feel crappy. But when you come in at a lower level, like an 18 or 19, you might have classic symptomology. The most common symptom of COVID was a headache. And we knew that in the first couple of weeks. So we're trying to tell people, hey, if you understand how testing works, PCR versus antigen testing, if you understand viral load, if you understand co-infection, and you understand comorbidity, I have that data on all of my patients. Most people who get COVID don't know if they have a co-infection. They don't know their viral load. They don't know if they're sick from a staph infection on top of it, or H flu, or Moraxella catarrhalis. They have no idea. These people are running to a Walgreens or a CVS, getting a rapid test, thinking COVID's the worst thing in the world, or it's not. but they don't understand how it works. So if we don't dissect that as a country and really break down the who, what, where, when, how, and why, then we can get into the conversations of where did it come from? Where do we go next? How does this apply to medicine moving forward? There's a whole conversation that I can have with medical schools for years about how medicine can jump into the 21st century and still instead they're practicing in the 19th century. We're guessing at stuff. We're still, guessing and using an antibiotic for viruses that doesn't work. Someone comes in and we're treating the symptoms. We're causing antibiotic resistance. We're causing more problems upon more problems by not dissecting the data that we have from this thing. Look, it was a tough time for us. I don't think everybody should have been testing every single week, but because we did that, because we did such mass testing, we have such a different picture of viruses, bacteria, how they transmit, how to treat for them, and how to actually manage this thing moving forward. But we're not having, again, that conversation.
Okay, so I've had COVID 4 times.
Mm-hmm.
2 times I had zero symptoms. I went in with my daughter and who was sick, and they were like, "Well, we'll test you while you're here." And I was like, "Okay." And both times when they came back, or 2 of the times when they came back positive, like I was shocked. I was like, "Really?" 2 of the times I wasn't feeling good. I felt like I had a really bad cold, for lack of a better way to say it. I did have a headache on one of them. Taste and smell never went away. So the symptoms change from person to person. Is that because of internal makeups of people? Is that because I take a lot of vitamins. I already take a lot of. So is it because of that? What causes that to change? Because that makes it hard, don't you think, to gather the data effectively?
Yeah, and it's confusing to people. I usually start that with a whole dissertation in my office with COVID's not a living thing. Okay, COVID's like an amino acid; it's either active or inactive, right? So if you understand the virus itself, it's in this capsule. I'm gonna get a little sciencey for you, but there's about 27 proteins inside the capsule of that virus. When you take a piece of paper and make a copy on a copier, and then you make a copy of that copy, and then a copy of that over and over and over and over. That's what a virus is doing. Eventually, that copy is going to become so unrecognizable you can't read what's on the paper, but eventually it will develop this weird shape on the outside. That's the spike protein mutation. The spike protein is what you're getting the symptomology from. Okay. When you get COVID the first time, there's a lot of, we kind of go back, but there's a lot of reason why people got very sick and some died early on from this thing. And there's 2 reasons. One, is it novelty? If you and I were to go to an indigenous island somewhere in the South Pacific and hug all the indigenous people, they would probably get sick and some would die off from stuff we're immune to. Okay. So novelty is very important. But when you understand how that spike protein mutates, you're getting what's called B and T lymphocytes the first time you get COVID. The B cells are your memory cells, your T cells are your helper cells. So the next time you get COVID, it's because that spike protein mutated to fool your system. That spike protein is causing the majority of the symptomology the next time you get it. But you have memory cells to what the 27 proteins on the inside of that capsule of that virus. So you're not getting as sick the next time. It's like you're getting less and less and less. However, the symptomology changes when you look at the overall data from all these thousands of patients. You can see the sicker ones had a higher viral load. Again, the majority of the sick ones had a co-infection. So when you went to the doctor and they tested you for COVID, did they test you on a rapid test or did they test you on a PCR test?
The first time was on a rapid test. The last time was on a rapid. Actually, both times it was on a rapid test is when I didn't have any symptoms. The other 2 times, I can't remember the third one. The second one was not rapid. I don't remember the third one at all.
All right. So when a patient comes into my office and tells me they had COVID a month ago, and I ask them how, and they say they had a rapid home test, I laugh at them, and I don't mean that to be mean, but
And none of them were rapid home tests. They were rapid tests at the office. Okay, all right.
If you are testing on a PCR test, when we went through the cycle threshold and the CT value, you need 9 copies of a virus at the very top end to tell me it's in your system and bound 100%. And people will negate PCR testing, but I could show you how it works. In succession, again, repeat the data. It's the only way to properly test for COVID. On a rapid test, in contrast to a PCR test, you need 10 to the 6th to 10 to the 9th power of virus. What does that mean? Instead of 9 copies, I need 9 million to 9 billion to tell me you are positive on a rapid antigen test, okay? So if you are positive on a rapid antigen test, 100% of the time, you are positive for something, because a rapid antigen test can turn positive for any coronavirus, including the common cold. There are 7 we test for in the office. So scientifically, a rapid test tells me 0, except you have something, but a negative tells me nothing because you need such a high viral load to turn that test positive. So when someone comes in and tells me they had COVID on a rapid test, I laugh at them because you cannot confirm COVID on a rapid test, period. Also, with a rapid test, if you're not doing a panel, I can't tell if you have a co-infection. Remember, there's 31 things on my panel. So if someone comes in my office sick, I swab them, it goes to the lab. The next day I can tell them you have flu A and a staph infection. You have COVID and Moraxella catarrhalis. You have COVID and staph, whatever it is. And I mentioned the guy 3.5 years ago, COVID, staph, H flu, RSV all at the same time. That was an anomaly. I've never seen somebody come back with 4 things at once. But the majority of sick folks had a co-infection. Most of the time it was Staph aureus. Okay. That is very important to understand, because when you're testing cops every single week and you're testing them regardless of symptoms, they're coming into work. So it's a, preventative test. So I'm testing the same 100 cops every week. Most of them would come back negative. Okay. But you would get the 9 or 10 or 4 a week, whatever, that would come back positive. Now, look, sometimes, and these are all asymptomatic because at the time they're coming into the police department to test, they're not having a symptom, of course, but they would then sometimes turn into symptoms because at some point those signals would start to wax, where the signal would increase. In other words, the viral load was increasing and they would develop a symptom. But the majority of folks that came back positive for just COVID did not have a classic symptom. Again, the most common symptom was a headache. Second would be fatigue. For them to develop a cough, a fever, or shortness of breath, you need a lot of viral load. And for the ones that did, most of the time they had a co-infection on top of it. So again, I have all of that data on my patients. Most people have a very myopic view of COVID. They tell it from the story of, I went to the doctor, I tested positive 4 times, rapid test. Again, I'm laughing at it. I don't know if you had a co-infection. I don't know what your viral load was. And you have all these same doctors participating in this program here that we have all this information. We've been doing this for 4 years. If they would understand how to do this properly, they could educate their patients a lot better. And we wouldn't be going still through this exercise of me walking through the airport, watching people wearing masks. It's gotten ridiculous at this point.
Okay. So I'm going to go back to your book. You know, it's not a hit piece on Fauci. It's more, it's more of a why we, basically how we ended. Is it fair to say it's kind of like how we ended up with what we did, or why we messed up with what we did in regard to COVID? It would be more of that. How would you describe it and to summarize it then?
The majority of this book, I could have gotten out in the first year, and I wanted to. And enough patients tell me after this dissertation that you need to write a book. My father died in the middle of it, and that was after 3 Pfizer vaccines, and there's something to that in the book as well. But I mean, the book it talks about how testing works, the language of a pandemic, what is a virus, what I just explained to you, how testing really works, antibodies and antibody tests. It talks about vaccines. It gives you the basics of COVID, from what you were, again, never told. I mean, we're sitting here 4 years into this, and your original question was, who cares? Who cares is you were never told any of this. This is the basic stuff that is going to prepare you for the next thing. It also, you have to understand all of this to get into the conversation of the who, what, where, when, how, and why. Where did this come from? Did we manage this properly? Who's culpable? And if we knew this information 2 months into testing, and we still went through a 2-year exercise of lockdowns and schools being closed, that's unacceptable. Guys like me who were talking about this were shuttered. I get shadow banned now. I'll do interviews with folks like you, and I get pulled off YouTube immediately for what? Talking about how testing works. Why does the government not want you to know this stuff? People automatically look at this cover and think this is a hit piece. This is, they say it's MAGA. It's, Fauci was a good man. I talk about him 3 times in the book. I mentioned President Trump twice in the book. There's not one political narrative in there. But if you understand COVID the way I understand COVID and my staff does, you will see every virus differently. You will see you will question every doctor differently. I always ask the question of these folks, like that cardiologist, based on what? If you're going to give me advice, I want to know what it's based on. You're telling me to wear a mask on a plane based on what? We don't wear masks for viruses, and I can explain all that. The book is the basics that everybody in this country should know and should have known in the first 2 months of this, but still doesn't 4 years into it.
Okay, but part of the reason why it doesn't is because obviously the narrative that was put out was to do two things. One, silence people like you, or marginalize, one of the two, or and then at the same time push this idea that, again, wearing a mask, even a little gaiter, is going to be sufficient to survive, and this is the only way that we're going to avoid just mass casualties. So, but there has to be someone behind all of that to say, I don't want this data that you came up with. I don't want this data out there because of X, because of X. What is that X? Why is it that you think that people did not want that data out there, and fed this narrative to create both crazies and this false claims out there of what was going on?
That's a great $64,000 question, right? And I don't get into the political narrative in the book, but people ask me all the time. And you can kind of see the trends happening. You can kind of see when they asked Trump if he was going to wear a mask and he said no, then it was like everybody on the left wanted to wear a mask and do it in force to show you, we're being safe. Like, come on. A lot of people say follow the money. I mean, you look at Moderna stock went from $35 to $400. I don't know, did it get released from the lab? Was it an accident and they took advantage of it? Was it because of the funding? We can go down a million different rabbit holes, but if you don't understand the basics, how can you even address those rabbit holes? The biggest one I get on shows like yours is people want to question the validity of PCR testing because the inventor said at some point it should never be used for diagnosis. And I can tell you that it's been used for years before COVID existed for diagnosis, and it works really well if you work with reputable labs. I don't work with Quest. I don't work with LabCorp. We work with very boutique small labs that I trust the PhDs that I've been working with for years. They're very reputable people that care about their character and their licenses. And again, I could repeat the data over and over. I get more questions about rabbit holes all the time than what did you see from COVID? Like, how do you treat it? Did ivermectin work? I get more rabbit hole questions than anything that's pertinent to, like, how do we solve the problem? So the book kind of answers a lot of those problems. I got a second book coming out called Vaccine Fiction, to talk more about what we're seeing on the back end. And again, it's not political. It's just, this is what we see from the vaccines. This is what's walking in our office from, whether it's clotting or heart issues or joint issues. And it talks about what's in the vaccines and how they work. You asked this question of why. I just read an article, I think it was yesterday, and I sent it to my wife. I said, Kelly, read this and tell me what you think. And it's an article about, they're doing a study to try to show that the ninth round of vaccines is working, and it's helping people with long-term resistance to COVID. And the person, the PhD who was doing the study, they started it in Washington State. And they said, well, this is the best place to start it because this is where the virus started and this is where the most exposure was. And they said, because our population was very compliant in getting vaccines. Well, they don't know if their population had COVID every week because they didn't test them like I did with my 100, plus cops, thousands of cops we did every week. They don't have any of that information. I'm looking at their study, and their study is to back up multiple boosters. That's something you'll hear about in a year, and they're going to say, look, all these vaccines have worked. But when you look at the studies, which by the way are funded by the NIH, they're biased studies. So you still kind of see they're continuing down this road without going back to guys like me saying, well, let me compare that to your data. So I don't know. There's still a narrative here. Maybe it's cognitive distortion again, as we mentioned before. Maybe they don't want to admit they were wrong. You'll never hear CNN come up and say, hey, maybe we shouldn't have put that death count up on TV every day. It freaked too many people out. You'll never hear, Dr. Fauci say, oh, well, I was wrong. I mean, they came out about the mask thing and he said, well, that was kind of made up. But you force people to wear face coverings, which, by the way, made them sicker. Most of the folks who were wearing these things had bacterial infections when they were coming in. I think it's a lot of cognitive distortion, but if you talk to political people who want to go down the rabbit hole, it's usually a money grab somewhere. And when I see commercials for the 9th booster and the 10th booster, and now there's a vaccine for everything out there in the world, I just think that there's got to be something nefarious behind it. But I don't want to put my finger on it and risk my credibility by saying, hey, I discovered. Right. But yeah, where there's smoke, there's a fire somewhere.
In Acts 5, we see that when Peter and the other disciples were ordered to stop talking about Jesus, they responded, "We obey God and not man." In 2020, we saw something we never thought we could see in this country. They shut down our churches. After decades of removing God from schools and public institutions, they went straight at our community. Unfortunately, we as Christians did not know what to do, and even worse, we chose to listen to false prophets masquerading as Christians on how to respond. I recognize this is the only beginning, and we need to know how to respond. We have a duty to say no to unjust laws, but as Christians, we have a greater duty to God. In my book, On the Duty of Christian Civil Disobedience, I use biblical teachings to help believers know when and how to stand up to those in charge when they ask us to commit evil. You can go to peterdemas.org to find out about our duty to say no. And when you type in the code UNCOMMON, you can get 10% off your order. That's uncommon at peterdemas.org. Remember, we are to obey God and not man. Yeah, and I think the reason why I ask you the question is because, I'm an avid studier of history. I love history, but I also love history in the sense of, I like to kind of say, oh, hey, we've done this before and it failed, and if we tried it this way, it would have worked better, et cetera, so that we can learn how to move forward. And I ask that question because I recognize that, again, the studies you're doing and other things, they're slowly like allowing some of the information in, but it's even still like the mainstream medical doctors aren't. Paxlovid was what I was prescribed when they gave me COVID.
On a rapid test that you didn't even know you had COVID.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, exactly. And I have my primary care doctor still requires you to wear a mask when you walk into his office. It's
Fire that person.
Yeah, well, we have no more medical primary care doctors. I have to have like somebody I can name, and that's kind of where part of that is. So I guess where I'm looking at this is, so I see the fact that it's still a lot of this stuff is still there, even though when certain things are being released. Ivermectin is okay. It's not going to kill you. It's not the horse tranquilizer like they said. But Walgreens still won't fulfill it unless it's small doses that. So I'm like, okay, so if we could figure out the source, the cause of it, because I mean, you said it earlier, when we're treating only the symptoms, colonial days, they would put leeches when you had an infection, and of course your swelling would go down, and they're like, hey, we cured it, then the patient would die. It's like we're doing that both obviously during the times of COVID, but we're also doing it socially and politically. And I think that's where I'm asking that question, because if we could figure out the source, and I agree with you, I think money is a good theory. I think that power and pride is another good theory. I struggle with trying to figure out like where it comes from and who. And it's easy to point fingers at an individual and say, oh, it's Bill Gates. Oh, it's President. Whatever it is. But in reality, I think I don't think it's that simple. And so that's why I keep kind of wondering on the why. And so if you take the data from your book. And I'm really excited about the data from your next one too, because I really struggled with whether to get a vaccine or not, and I ended up not doing it. And that was actually a God story that kept me from not doing it. But when I look at that data, or I know that data is out there, it just seems to me that we can learn something from it, but people don't want to. So again, to me, there has to be something behind it that we have to break down before we can do that. Maybe it's time.
I think they ran with the story for so long during a political season that they realized that they could capitalize on, and they ran with it for so long that now they can't back away from it. Now they have to do everything else to support that story, and that's sad. You think about these kids who committed suicide and the kids that lost years of learning, or and I'll tell you some sad ones. I mean, I used to do what do you call it, assisted livings every week, and we had I think about 8 of them at one time. So we would go to the same assisted livings every same day of the week, sometimes multiple, 2 on Wednesday, 2 on Saturday, whatever it was. And I would watch 90-year-old birthday parties through the window where, I'm inside and the Millie is sitting there turning 90 and her family is outside in the cold with a cake waving because they're not allowed in and she's not allowed out. And then later she would die, not of COVID, but of old age or depression or whatever it was. And I watched enough of those to realize that this conversation, again, going back to your original question of who cares, Millie's family cares. My friend Mike's dad died during COVID because he was vented, and they couldn't even congregate at the funeral together. We did so much damage to people that everybody should be screaming for a conversation on this. And it starts with, again, this, and I get I get really, I didn't write this for me. I wrote this for my patients. I wrote this for people who I couldn't tell this story every single day. And again, it could take 4 hours to get into antibodies and vaccines, and you can't do that in a 5 minute interview, even if an hour interview. Um, so I wrote this for folks that then wake them up a little bit and say, okay, now we kind of got the basics here. Where do we go? But for my friend Mike's, who's dad died during this thing, and his mother became a patient of ours. She had COVID. Why, by the way, anytime somebody had it in a household who was symptomatic, 100% of the time, everybody in that household had it 100% of the time. But again, 85% didn't have a classic symptom. So they're going, really? What do you mean I'm positive? If you were positive in somebody's house, if you lived in that house with a symptomatic person, you had it 100%. I still get people that come up to me and go, my husband had it really bad, but I never caught it. I'm like, were you in the same house? Yeah. Was he positive? You tested him on PCR? Yes. You had it. And no, I didn't. I didn't have a symptom. I go, neither did 85% of my patients. Like, if we don't get out of this myopic view and put it in perspective, how are we going to move on? We're still living in like as if this was the first week of COVID and no one has learned a thing.
All right, I'm going to completely shift gears because we're getting kind
Yeah.
of. I want to talk about your show, yeah, two mics live. I'm assuming you address these type of issues. What, or do you talk about? You told me that you had ball players on. So tell me about your show. Tell me about it.
Thanks. I appreciate it. I started it with a podcaster who I wound up, I did his show a couple years ago on we did a 2 hour interview on COVID. And we did so well on air together that we wound up doing a couple shows ago. So I asked him to do an on-air show with me. His name is Mike Calderison, and my wife Kelly's on the show. It's great. We don't talk about COVID, believe it or not. We did one show on COVID. Wednesdays is News Breakdown Wednesday. So tonight we're going to be talking about the earthquake, and I got a few things in politics. Rand Paul. It's a fun show. Monday we kind of do deep dives. We just did one into the Second Amendment this week, and then Fridays is Open Mic Friday, where guests like you can come on and talk about whatever you want. But we usually stick to the issues of the day. It's a unique perspective, and it's a crazy world. And we have a lot of fun doing it. The audience has grown. We just started it in December, and already it's growing and growing and growing. So just got on YouTube and X. I get so nervous because YouTube pulls everything down they don't like. So if you can't mention the word vaccine, I mean, that's how I was on an interview in, where is it? Two of them out of the UK were like within the first 5 minutes of asking me like how testing worked, they get pulled off YouTube. So I don't understand, back to what you had said before, why it's still happening. But someone out there does not want you to hear what's going on. So we try to break down those type of issues on Two Mics Live, and it's a lot of fun.
So I'm curious. So you interview people, you talk about news, you do different things. What's your favorite thing to do on the show? Like, is there something in there particular you're just like, oh man, I love Wednesdays because I get to talk about this, or what is it that you seem to be like look forward to?
Wednesdays are more like my show because I get to break down the news and we really get to delve into it with three different personalities and opinions. I've had guests on though. I mentioned Brian Bowringer. I had Jim Leyritz. I had Christina Bobb, who's Trump's attorney, on. I had Ed Dowd on recently, who wrote Cause Unknown. That was a good interview, and hearing him from a finance perspective. He wrote a book on
Right.
the vaccines, but then he was fascinating. So every day is different. I love it, and Friday is where we get to talk to regular people and say what do you think, and your fingers on the pulse. I don't want to talk to some political pundit all the time. I want to know what's going on in Tennessee, right? Tell me what's happening on the ground. What do you see, and how can we help solve the world's problems? Now, how do we get everybody to listen to that? And kind of, who knows? We can't even get people to listen to, actual data. So who figured it out?
Well, data's boring. Don't you know that? I mean, you can't, I mean, you get, I mean, you start reading it and I mean, God forbid you actually read the studies that are on there as opposed to the headline. I mean, come on.
I did a study on COVID. What was it? It was the CARES Act and how it affected testing and treatment. That's in the Library of Congress. That was my dissertation, and it's so boring. I wouldn't recommend anybody read that. That's why when I wrote this book, it's not about. It's not. It's just. It's putting the data into anecdotal stories, so it's not boring to read. It's actually.
Right.
I use my. I do some stand up on the side. I've been doing it 24 years. So I use my humor in there, and some people come back and laugh at some stuff that it might not have been funny 4 years ago, but now it's kind of hysterical when you think about it.
When you learning how to communicate as a stand-up comic, I mean, that's impressive because I mean, obviously there's a timing issue, there's all that stuff, but then you also had to take that from a cop's perspective where your communication and a lot of times is crowd control, using your voice and your mannerisms to control a situation, to calm a situation, or sometimes just to shut people down. So you're moving from that area to this, plus the data. You're obviously a very data driven, very, right brain person. Was that is that difficult for you to kind of realize, okay, I'm in this position versus this one? Was there a transition for you, or are you just pretty kind of fluid in that regard?
I get bored easily. Talk about when I was a cop, that was another lifetime ago. I've got, between 5 different degrees and licenses and certifications. I have 3 business degrees. I'm a police academy cert. I'm a private pilot. So it's about changing gears sometimes. I'll be in the office dealing with medical stuff and analytics or whatever we do there, and we do primary care, integrative medicine. Then we, believe it or not, we have to do a lot of aesthetics to stay alive because insurance doesn't pay. So we do Botox and, fillers and PRP, all this fun stuff. So I'm like doing that stuff. And then if I have a comedy show that night, and I'm like, I literally have to switch gears. So midday in the office, I'm like, all right, I'm doing my set for my staff to make sure I'm rehearsing it right. And then I'm running off to the comedy, to just shift gears. But I like living that way a little bit better. I would get monotonously bored if I was sitting behind a desk doing the exact same thing every day. And it's funny when people want to look at my background and they want to criticize everything, right? If they think they're not going to like the book because it's whatever they assume it is, and most of the time they're wrong. They want to criticize that. Why would I want to take advice from a cop? Well, okay, I was a former cop, but you got to understand, I've been running medical clinics for years, and I manage a medical staff. And because I had 19,000 patients, they go, "That's not a lot in the scheme of things." I go, "You name me one practitioner who kept that much horizontal data on 19,000 patients, and I'll give you a gold medal because nobody has." But they love to criticize you in every little. So you just got to keep your head about it. I've probably blocked about 500 people on social media because some of these crackpots out there, I cannot believe how COVID triggers folks. And that does come up in the comedy show sometimes, one will translate into the other, but you just got to keep centered. And I like to kind of be diverse. And hey, look, I know you're a Yankee fan. I told you in about 2 weeks, I'm going to be down there playing on their tournament team. So that's another gear shift for me. I can forget about COVID, forget about my book, forget about everything, and just go play baseball for a couple days.
That's awesome. That's so good. And I didn't realize that 19,000 subjects would be not statistically significant. I came from the social science background. Well, 100 is statistically significant in that area. So,
Right. I had 15 for my dissertation for one part of it. People really don't get it. I wish people would let their guards down, especially the folks on the left. It's always the people that need to read this book that never will. I wish they would put their guards down and just realize, look, this is coming from the practitioners who did this at first. And literally, I could have saved you all from lockdowns and masks and nonsense for all of those years. We could have saved a lot of restaurateurs and people who went out of business. That's the sad part. So to not talk about that is derelict in somebody's duty. I know it's
right.
great that, interviewers come up and say, "Hey, can we have this discussion?" I just wish it could be a worldwide discussion. Look, this book gets censored on Amazon still. Amazon won't let me promote it due to what they said is current events. And I don't know if you saw in the news, it got buried, but about 5 weeks ago, Jim Jordan's Judiciary Committee came out and uncovered emails from the White House to Amazon asking them to censor books on COVID and vaccines. My book happens to be one of them. You haven't heard that story. You can look it up. I'm happy to send you
Yeah.
the article on it. But there was a huge, they unmasked this guy who asked Amazon a few times, and Amazon pushed back and then finally went with it. So there's still a lot of censorship and shadow banning going on, which really sucks because, you're just trying to put out a work that I worked hard on. I talk
Yeah.
about my dad in this where he passed away, and that was really tough for me. I had begged him not to get a shot. I'm glad you didn't. These things, look, I didn't recommend a shot for 2 reasons. One, and not for anything you would think. We didn't think there was going to be bad stuff. We weren't sure. We didn't know. Again, would never risk my reputation on just guessing. We didn't recommend it for 2 reasons. One, because they don't work. They give you 120-day antibody response measured in practice, which we have recorded. And two, you don't need it. I had 4,000 patients who had COVID out of 19,000. None of them passed away, not one. So imagine, put yourself in my shoes. If I had come to you and you were the guy, you were me, and I said, "Peter, do I need this shot?" The answer would have been a laughable no. I haven't lost a patient. Everybody's recovering in 2 days. Why would I give you an experimental shot mRNA technology for something that you don't need and doesn't work. Logically, it doesn't make sense. So we didn't recommend a shot for those reasons. The folks that did get shots, all of a sudden we started seeing issues coming back in droves. That's where Fauci's for vaccine fiction is going into now. But look, we would never, I care about my credibility. All right. I care about my reputation. I'm happy to come on shows like this and be an open book, but people really got to let their guard down. There's such a political dichotomy of, masking versus not masking, or COVID was, bad versus it didn't exist. Everybody's got to stop. COVID is real, but it's not as bad as everybody thought. And there's a lot of reasons. The who, what, where, when, and why is all right there for you, folks. We just got to analyze it. We can talk about it. We can change the future moving forward. And hopefully, if disease X ever shows up and something unknown is facing us, we'll be a little bit more prepared rather than, caught off guard, because that's exactly where we are right now.
Well, I appreciate it so much. I've really enjoyed this conversation. You said we could talk about something for 4 hours. There's so much that I want to ask you that's there. I definitely, when your new book comes out, I definitely want to get a hold of it and talk about it. But we're out of time. But thank you so much for coming on, and I'm going to tune in. I'm going to tune in tonight as well for your Two Mics Live, because I like current events. I like all that stuff. I'd be curious to see how this plays out.
Why don't you pop on? I will send you a link and you can pop on for 5 minutes, introduce your show, and say hello to our audience. How about that?
That would be good.
All right.
That sounds good.
Shoot me your info, and I'll get I'll make sure I get you the link today.
Perfect. All right. Thank you so much. I appreciate it, and I look forward to talking with you again.
My pleasure. Thanks, Peter.